Mark Rogers TV talking some more National Signing Day and talking Carolina Blue with Jeff Greenberg of Sports Glutton. And the Tar Heels ranked right in that mid-20s range for National Signing Day with 19 signees. We bring in Jeff to talk about it. Jeff, we always appreciate the time. Good to see you, and pretty good class for Larry Fedora.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, good to be here. Yeah, I think overall, if you saw his press conference, he was very pleased with the quality that they got. They brought in 19 guys, tried to get a few more, but then they were able to also flip a few, as the term that I think is the buzzword this season is flip. That's the new thing everybody wants to know, who you flipped and who flipped, and I think they did their share of both. But 19 guys, solid, like you said, in the mid-20s, about third in the ACC, which is pretty strong considering the Clemsons and the Florida States are always going to be at the top two. They're actually in the top 5 in the country, so representing the ACC up there. The other thing that stood out, though, with this class is of the 19, 8 were 4-star players. And for a program like North Carolina to be under the cloud that they are, in all honesty, in terms of the NCAA and not knowing what's going on, and the fact that if you ask any of the coaches, and actually if you ask Fedora, since the first day he stepped on campus, he has never walked into a recruit's house and not had to answer questions about the NCAA stuff, which is frustrating for him because it all happened before him. But still to pull in 8 4-star guys, which is actually more 4-star guys than teams like South Carolina, Oregon, TCU, Miami, Florida, Virginia Tech, Nebraska, Wisconsin, that's good company to be in if you're a North Carolina football fan, and I think they did a good job from that standpoint.
Jeff, what you just said, I think, really brings it into focus that despite those issues that are still hanging over this program, you just listed a lot of close to blue bloods in college football, and if North Carolina was able to out-recruit them and sign those players and close the deal on those guys, it's one thing to be on the cusp and to be on those particular players' 3 or 4 or 5 list. It's one thing to close the deal and get those players to campus. You mentioned Florida State, you mentioned Clemson, right in the top 5. Fortunately for Carolina, they're in the other division, and to out-recruit also not just the Wisconsins and the Nebraskas and the Oregons, but also to outclass within the division is obviously key, because that's who they're competing against to try to get to that ACC championship game.
Absolutely, and if he's pulling in a class that's ranked higher, to your point, with Miami, Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech, Duke, the other strong teams within your division, then that's a good thing. And and I would add to the fact, beyond the NCAA stuff, coming off a disappointing end of the season, to still hold on to the guys they got and pick off a few more, it tells a little bit that they're doing the right things on the recruiting trail and securing guys, and more importantly, though, even with a disappointing finish, holding on to those guys. And I think one of the keys to that, though, was 9 of the 19 players already enrolled in January, so they were already signed and delivered before the effects of a bad end of the season could really take hold.
Jeff, we know that one recruiting class does not make a roster, so you bring in 19. That's right around probably the lower end of the quantity spectrum that most teams bring in, usually in that 20 to 25 range, and you've got 105 or so on a roster, 85 scholarships, so it takes multiple years. But this number 23 or 28 recruiting class, depending on your service, is roughly what Carolina's done under Larry Fedora. Is that correct?
It is, and I think the one thing you mentioned too, with trying to build a roster overall, he's had to fight with some reductions before this point. So really, to build that depth, I think what you look at when you see these 19 guys is they filled needs that had to be filled and added depth in areas that were very much in need. So they didn't just go out and get players and try to find whoever they could. They really did fill needs that they had. I mean, glaring needs on the line, especially. I think they did a great job on both lines to try to fill some gaps, the defensive backfield. And then they added, with an offense like that, you still need to look for those playmakers. And they brought in the number 1 running back out of South Carolina, and Tyson Williams. Then you bring in a few receivers as well. Add to that Mike Hughes, who some people think was the number 1 athlete in North Carolina. He's going to come in as a cornerback. He just led his team to the state championship, was the MVP. His name is Mike Hughes, and I think you're going to see they may even try to give some time to him on both sides of the ball. And so I think, like, again, when you look at this, they filled where they needed to fill. And I would say, first of all, that started in the trenches on both sides of the line.
Jeff, I'm looking at 4 guys ranked in ESPN's top 300 players. You mentioned Tyshawn Williams out of Sumter, North Carolina, at number 145 overall, one of the top 10 running backs in the nation. Jalen Dalton, another North Carolina kid, at 64, and this is overall, so that's a very high-ranking center and a tight end as well. When you look at that list, who are some of the guys that really stand out, some of the guys that you're excited to see on the field?
The center you mentioned, Tommy Hatton out of New Jersey. He's the number 2 ranked center in the country, number 1 in the Northeast, number 1 out of New Jersey. And he's just a fiery, physical, hard-nosed kid that you need at center. They lost a little bit of that last year when Russell Bodine left early, and he ended up starting for the Bengals this year. He was the one that kind of added that grit to the line, and I think Hatton has that ability. He actually was the MVP of Nike's big event out in Oregon called The Opening, where apparently, I mean, he dominated in all his one-on-ones. So that was a huge get for the offensive line. They added a few other guys on there. You mentioned Dalton. Dalton was a big pickup because it came down to the wire between Virginia Tech and North Carolina, and Dalton is another guy that can be that anchor on the defensive line and add some depth where they really needed it to try to shore up the defense up front. Also, when you add in the tight end, they had 2 of the flips that they had. One was Jake Vargas out of Florida. He was the, I think, 13th tight end in the nation, according to ESPN, was set to go to Wake Forest and flipped over to North Carolina. And then the last flip that was kind of a late get, which is, again, a need, which is defensive line, was Strobridge out of Florida. He was committed to Kentucky, and in the last week actually decommitted and then committed and signed with North Carolina. That was a big get. I know that Fedora was in big on that, but also their new addition to the staff, Gene Chizek, was also a major player in trying to flip him from Kentucky. So those guys on the line are going to be the ones that really, I think, symbolize how this class moves forward. Again, you have defensive backs like Mike Hughes and J.K. Britt and Corey Bell out of North Carolina that are going to help shore up the defensive backfield because, as they were told when they were being recruited, you know, all positions are up for grabs right now. When the defense turns in a performance like they did last year, you kind of have to come back and earn your spots, and I think those guys are going to have a chance to do that.
Hey, Jeff, when you look at these 19 players and couple that with the personnel already on the roster carrying over to 2015, what is an early projection of how good you feel about this team? Where are those gaps? Where could some freshmen that we see on this list possibly get some playing time?
I think you can definitely see some ability from the defensive line standpoint. Strobridge and Dalton could squeeze out some time. The guys in the defensive backfield, Mike Hughes, I think, is going to see the field this year, maybe on both sides of the ball, according to what the coaches are talking, because he's that dynamic of an athlete. I think, you know, depending on how the health of the line stands up, you could see a guy like a Tommy Hatton getting in there. You could see a few of the linebackers they brought in. Andre Smith. There's some need at linebacker. The starters they have are strong and coming back, but it's thin. So one of those guys goes down. You know, these freshmen may have to step up. Jonathan Sutton's another guy out of North Carolina, outside linebacker that may have to step in. So it kind of depends on the health. The guys returning from this past season, and there's a lot of them. I mean, that's one of the good things happening with North Carolina is they are finally developing that core that's coming back. I think they only had lost 6 seniors last year, and not all of them even started. So right now, there's some positions that are up for grabs, and I would say if you're on defense, all the positions are up for grabs in a sense because you've got a new defensive coordinator. You're switching from a 5-2 over the 4-2-5 over to the 4-3. So I think when you've got a new defensive coordinator, especially with the pedigree that Chizek has, there's going to be a lot of evaluations going on right now. And they're going to put the best people in, I think. They're not going to try to reserve a really strong player because, in all intents and purposes, this is a huge year for Fedora. This is the year he's pointed to. The season, the schedule sort of plays out for that opportunity. And so I think everybody coming in on the defensive side of the ball has a chance. You
brought up the name, Jeff. Gene Chizek. Very few times do we see a guy win a national championship as a head coach, find himself in a coordinator position just 4 years later. But that's the plight of Gene Chizek once Cam Newton left campus, and he had a rough season at Auburn a couple years ago in the SEC. Your thoughts about Chizek coming to Chapel Hill and possibly the impact there?
A lot of excitement. A lot of excitement from the fan base. A lot of excitement, I think, even from a recruiting standpoint, a player standpoint. In Chizek, you've got a guy that, like you said, he won a national championship as a head coach. He won a national championship with Mack Brown as his defensive coordinator at Texas. I know Mack Brown actually did have a good amount to say to him, both about Fedora as a coach and then to Fedora about Chizek as a coach. I think that was a mutual contact for these two guys. They've kind of followed each other around to similar schools and played against each other or coached against each other in certain situations. But with Chizek, I could be wrong, but he may be the highest paid assistant in UNC football history. So the administration, the athletic department is getting behind this hire. I think it's brought a lot of excitement because when you think about why he's coming in, Fedora is known to be an offensive mind. North Carolina has not had a problem with offense since he's been here. The problem is stopping enough of the other team's offense to secure some of these wins down the stretch. I think this year, when your defense is in the bottom third to bottom fourth of the country, changes had to be made. And I think if you ask the average fan and the average person following North Carolina football, a Gene Chizek hire was not expected and has very much caused a lot of excitement.
Jeff Greenberg joins us from Sports Glutton. Jeff has joined us a number of times over the past year to break down North Carolina personnel, knows his stuff and knows the Heels in particular. Jeff, what are some of those things you've been working on here? What's on your plate these days?
Have a few things that right now pursuing some a talk with Gene Chizek just to get his perspective on exactly what you asked, which is, coming from a 2 years being in the booth, so to speak, in the media, to coming back to the sidelines. I know he let out a little bit of his reasoning yesterday when he talked about the fact that he wanted to go somewhere where he had a respect for the head coach and respect for the opportunity. He said both of those things were present in the offer that North Carolina presented. I think that, getting to know exactly where his mind's at is what fans want to know. So sort of working on that. Doing a few things inside Carolina, the scout site, just to get some new perspectives from both a player standpoint and, like I said, coaching standpoint with Coach Chizek. But pretty soon we'll have a draft series again with Sports Glutton. Did that last year, was able to present it in a way with a player, which was Eric Ebron, a scout, which gave us a good rundown of the players that we didn't know about. I think that's what I was more excited to know about is, we know everybody that Todd McShays and Mel Kuypers are talking about. I wanted to know the guys the scouts are talking about. And he gave us a list of 10, and guys that were on that list all proved to be exactly what he said, some of them making the all-pro and definitely all-rookie teams. So we're going to try to do that again, too, as well, and bring another perspective from a scouting standpoint.
I always appreciate the breakdown, Jeff. It's really good stuff, and you mentioned a really good point on Chizek is when you've won a national championship, let alone just been a head coach at that level at a powerful SEC school or really anywhere within the Power 5 or the SBS, you've got to find the right fit where you're finding a head coach that you can work for, that you actually can look up to and have that respect for, and that's a key point that you just made right there about Chizek and Fedora.
Absolutely, and I think that goes both ways. I think if you're in a position like Larry Fedora, I would imagine a head coach in his position thinks long and hard about what it would mean to bring in another guy that's been so successful and reached the top as a head coach in the SEC, and be confident enough as a head coach to want a guy like that on your staff. And I think all signs point to Fedora saying, look, I want him to come fix the defense, and he's going to have the leeway and the leverage to do so. And it's starting even with bringing in his own assistants. I know the first guy he brought in was the Nebraska defensive coordinator under Bo Pelini. Papuchis has come along, and now he's going to add, I think, another coach and a DB coach. So I think Fedora's given him the reins on that side of the ball, and I think it's probably going to be a mutual partnership in trying to make this thing go forward.
Jeff Greenberg, Sports Glutton. Check him out there. Jeff, we always appreciate. Thanks so much for the information and the insight, sir.
No problem. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.